Welcome to History to Relax, where the world becomes quieter, the past feels close, and long journeys unfold at a slow and peaceful rhythm. Tonight, we begin a new story. It is a story not of a single person or a single country, but of an idea that grew slowly, across centuries, shaped by countless voices, changing forms again and again as different societies struggled to answer the same question. How should people live together? Some ideas appear suddenly, carried by one brilliant mind. Others rise in silence, forming piece by piece as generations face the same hardships. The idea we explore tonight belongs to this second kind. It did not start with a manifesto or a political speech. It began in ancient villages, in early attempts at fairness, in the quiet hopes of workers and farmers, and in the reflections of philosophers who wondered why some lives were marked by comfort while others were defined by struggle. Later, as towns grew into cities and factories reshaped the world, this idea gained new urgency. It took on clearer forms. It found its own thinkers and its own language. It inspired movements, created models of society, and opened debates that still continue today. Some embraced it with hope. Others feared it with deep suspicion. Many misunderstood it entirely. But whether admired or rejected, it left a strong mark on the modern world. Tonight, we begin at the beginning. Before political parties, before revolutions, before manifestos. We return to the early seeds of the idea, the ancient roots of human cooperation, and the first attempts to imagine a world where work, resources, and responsibilities might be shared instead of divided. This is a calm journey. There will be no arguments, only a slow walk through time, examining how people tried to answer questions about justice, community, and the basic structure of society. So settle in. Breathe gently. Let the noise of the day fall away. The story of socialism is long and full of turns. But here we take it step by step, quietly and thoughtfully, letting ideas unfold at a pace that invites rest. When you are ready, we will begin part 1, where the earliest seeds were placed in the soil long before anyone had a name for them. The story of socialism begins long before the word existed, long before factories, pamphlets, or modern politics. It begins in the small spaces where early human life unfolded. Long before writing, early communities faced the same question that would echo throughout later centuries. How do people survive together? In the earliest human groups, cooperation was not an ideal. It was a condition for survival. Food was gathered, hunted, or prepared through shared effort. Shelter was built for the whole community. Tools were passed from hand to hand. Knowledge flowed freely because holding it back would endanger everyone. These small bands were not societies of equality by conscious philosophy, but equality by necessity. The environment offered little room for hoarding or hierarchy. A harsh season, a failed hunt, or a sudden illness could harm the entire group. Mutual support was the only path to continuity. As centuries passed and communities settled near rivers and fertile valleys, new forms of cooperation appeared. Early agricultural villages depended on shared labor for tasks too large for isolated families. Irrigation systems required many hands to dig channels, maintain levees, and guide water through fields. Harvesting grain at the right moment demanded coordination. If a storm approached, every worker counted. Over time, this created a shared understanding. People realized that certain tasks worked best when the village functioned as one body. Even in these early times, inequality existed. Some families accumulated more grain or livestock. Some controlled trade routes or held spiritual authority. Yet the memory of interdependence remained strong. Traditions grew around shared resources. Communal granaries were built to store food not only for surplus, but for protection in times of crisis. Festivals reinforced the sense of belonging. In some regions, farmland was regularly redistributed among families to prevent land from remaining permanently in the hands of a few. This did not create a perfectly equal world, but it showed a clear desire to manage communal life in ways that acknowledged mutual responsibility. Human societies became more complex as cities rose and empires formed. Hierarchies hardened. Wealth and power concentrated in palaces and estates. But even in societies marked by strong class divisions, the question of fairness never disappeared. Philosophers and religious leaders often addressed the conditions of the poor, proposing that just societies should treat their members with dignity. Their voices formed some of the earliest roots of the moral ideas that later shaped socialist thought. In ancient Greece, thinkers questioned the nature of justice. Plato imagined a city where guardians lived without private property and devoted themselves to the common good. His vision was not socialism, but it contained recognizable elements. The idea that certain groups could set aside personal wealth for the sake of harmony reflected a longing for a society guided by shared purpose rather than personal gain. In early Christian communities, believers practiced forms of communal living. Members shared possessions, offered food to those who needed it, and rejected the pursuit of excessive wealth. These practices emerged not from political ideology, but from spiritual teachings that emphasized compassion, humility, and the dignity of every person. While not all Christian groups followed these customs, the model left a lasting impression. It introduced the belief that moral societies should care for those who are vulnerable, and that resources should serve the entire community. Other cultures developed parallel ideas. In parts of Asia, communal agricultural systems organized families into cooperative units. Land was often owned collectively, and harvests were distributed within the group. Ancient Chinese philosophies raised questions about inequality and the responsibilities of rulers toward the poor. In India, some monastic traditions embraced communal ownership, where wealth served the spiritual mission and the needs of the entire group. In many African societies, communal bonds formed the foundation of social life, with shared grazing lands, collective child-rearing, and community decision-making. None of these early examples were socialism in the modern sense, but they revealed patterns that would later influence socialist thinkers. They showed that people across cultures repeatedly returned to similar concerns. How do we share? How do we protect the vulnerable? How do we create fairness in a world shaped by scarcity, conflict, and power? The shift toward recognizable socialist ideas began when these moral concerns met a changing world. As trade expanded and cities grew, societies became wealthier in some sectors and harsher in others. The gap between rich and poor widened. Merchant elites emerged. Landlords accumulated estates. Urban workers lived in crowded conditions, often with little protection from illness or injury. These conditions sparked early reflections on economic justice. During the Middle Ages, some religious movements criticized the wealth of elites and emphasized equality among believers. Certain monastic orders practiced strict communal living, giving up personal property entirely. Reformers wrote about the dangers of greed and called for a return to a more balanced society. Although the term socialism did not exist, the ideas of shared responsibility and economic fairness continued to develop quietly within sermons, teachings, and local customs. A more formal shift appeared in the Renaissance and early modern period. New thinkers explored the structure of society with fresh eyes, influenced by the rediscovery of classical texts and the rise of scientific reasoning. Thomas More wrote of an imagined island where goods were shared and private property held no place. His work was not meant as a practical blueprint, but it raised questions about the nature of inequality and whether societies could be organized in radically different ways. In the centuries that followed, European thinkers developed more systematic critiques of economic life. They analyzed how wealth was created, how labor was distributed, and why certain groups held power over others. These reflections grew stronger as technological change accelerated. When the Industrial Revolution began, factories filled cities with smoke and noise. Workers endured long hours, low wages, and hazardous conditions. Families crowded into small tenements. Children joined the workforce. Traditional bonds of community weakened as people left rural villages for urban centers. It was in this setting that socialism, as a recognizable doctrine, started to form. But before reaching the writers who gave socialism its modern language, it is important to pause here and observe how deep its roots extend. The longing for fairness did not begin with philosophers of the 19th century. It grew slowly from the lived experiences of countless generations who struggled, cooperated, and searched for better ways to share the burdens of life. Every communal granary, every shared field, every monastic community, every village council, every early philosophical reflection contributed a small piece to the foundation on which later socialist thinkers would build. These early seeds did not grow into a unified tradition, yet they revealed an enduring truth about human societies. People continually return to questions of justice because inequality persists, and the desire for dignity is universal. As this long chain of ideas reached the modern world, the next phase of the story began. The Industrial Revolution created problems on a scale never seen before, and it pushed thinkers to develop new solutions with clarity and urgency. In the next part of this story, we will walk into the world of early utopian socialists, who imagined communities built on harmony and cooperation. Their visions were hopeful, creative, and at times deeply unrealistic. Yet they played a crucial role in shaping the language and aspirations of the movements that followed. The modern story of socialism begins with a quiet group of dreamers. They lived in a world marked by change, uncertainty, and hardship. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society at a pace no one had seen before. Machines replaced familiar ways of working. Cities swelled with new arrivals. Smokestacks rose above neighborhoods where people once lived close to the rhythms of the land. Old traditions weakened while new demands grew heavier each year. Amid this transformation, a few thinkers looked at the growing inequality around them and wondered whether society could be built upon different foundations. They were not revolutionaries. They were not political strategists. They were writers, philosophers, and social inventors who believed that the world could be softened and improved through cooperation, rational planning, and community life. Their ideas were sometimes simple, sometimes ambitious, sometimes impractical, yet they carried a hopeful spirit that would leave a lasting mark on the centuries to come. These early thinkers became known as the utopian socialists. They did not call themselves by this name. The label came later, applied by critics and successors who wished to distinguish between idealistic visions and more systematic theories. But the term captures something true about them. They believed that society could be transformed not by conflict, but by imagination. If people were shown a better model of living, they believed communities would naturally gravitate toward it. The first figure in this story is Henri de Saint-Simon, a French aristocrat who lived through the turbulence of the French Revolution. He was fascinated by the rapid advance of science and industry, and he believed these forces could be redirected to improve the lives of the many rather than enrich the few. In his view, society would function best when led by scientists, engineers, and productive workers who understood how to create real value. He imagined a world organized around cooperation instead of privilege, guided by knowledge rather than inherited wealth. Saint-Simon believed that human progress depended on replacing competition with coordination. Factories, transport networks, education, and public services could be planned for the benefit of everyone. Although he never described a complete blueprint of a socialist society, his central idea became a recurring theme in later movements. The idea that social organization should match the needs of the people, and that leaders should be chosen for their contributions rather than their birth, marked a quiet break from the traditional order. Another important voice was Charles Fourier, a thinker whose imagination carried him into worlds unlike anything seen before. Fourier rejected the society of his time. He believed it was disordered, unjust, and poorly suited to human nature. Instead of trying to reform it piece by piece, he envisioned entirely new communities called phalansteries. These were self-sufficient settlements designed to harmonize work, leisure, and social life. Each member would have tasks suited to their natural interests and temperaments. Work would become enjoyable rather than painful. Passions would be balanced and respected rather than suppressed. Fourier's ideas were colorful and at times eccentric. He described cooperative living arrangements, shared kitchens, collective child rearing, and workplaces designed around pleasure rather than obligation. Some of his predictions ventured far into fantasy. Yet beneath these imaginative details lay a sincere desire to address the isolation and exploitation that defined many early industrial cities. Fourier believed that if people lived in communities built around cooperation and self-expression, conflict and misery would diminish. His followers attempted to build phalansteries in Europe and later in North America. Most of these communities faced difficulties. Some lacked funding. Others faced internal disagreements. Many collapsed quickly, but their existence revealed something important. People were willing to experiment with new forms of society, even when success was uncertain. They were searching for alternatives to the harsh conditions they saw around them. A third figure stands at the center of early socialist thought. Robert Owen, a Welsh industrialist, believed that character and behavior were shaped by environment. He managed a cotton mill in Scotland and introduced reforms that reflected his belief in the power of surroundings to influence human life. Owen shortened working hours, improved housing, established schools, and banned child labor under a certain age. His mill became one of the most humane workplaces in Britain. Owen believed society could be redesigned through education, cooperation, and well-planned communities. He founded New Lanark, a model village that drew interest from across Europe. Later, he attempted to create new cooperative settlements in both the United Kingdom and the United States. Most of these initiatives faced challenges, yet the experiments left a deep impression on those who visited or read about them. They showed that workplaces and communities could be organized around shared benefit rather than competition. Across Europe and North America, small groups of people formed cooperative settlements inspired by the visions of these early thinkers. Some communities lasted only a short time. Others survived for years. Each attempt carried its own mixture of hope, difficulty, and revelation. Life in these communities was often demanding. People had to agree on rules, distribute tasks, resolve disagreements, and maintain shared property. Success required a rare balance of skills and unity that was difficult to sustain. Yet even when they failed, the experiments left behind valuable lessons about human cooperation and the challenges of building new social structures. The utopian socialists shared a belief that people were capable of living together peacefully if given the right environment. They trusted in the power of reason, planning, and goodwill. They imagined societies where inequality would be softened, work would serve the common good, and education would raise citizens who cared about one another. Their critics argued that these visions were impractical. Their supporters argued that the existing world was so harsh that imagining alternatives was essential. What truly distinguished these early thinkers was the gentle tone of their ideas. They approached social change through persuasion rather than confrontation. They believed that if better systems were demonstrated, people would choose them voluntarily. Their dreams did not rely on upheaval. Instead, they relied on patient transformation. This made their ideas appealing to those who feared chaos but longed for fairness. Although many of their communities failed, and their visions sometimes lacked clarity, their influence on later movements was profound. They introduced concepts that would echo through the writings of later socialist thinkers: cooperative ownership, shared responsibility, planned production, protection for workers, affordable housing, free education, public welfare. Each of these ideas has roots that stretch back to the utopian socialists. Their importance lies not only in their proposals, but in the spirit with which they offered them. They believed in human potential at a time when many workers lived in dim, overcrowded rooms and worked long hours in dangerous factories. They believed that society could be shaped with intention, not simply inherited as an unchangeable fate. And they believed that reason and compassion were tools powerful enough to redesign the world. The utopian socialists formed the bridge between ancient reflections on fairness and the more rigorous theories that soon followed. They laid the foundations for those who would approach society with sharper analytical tools. As the 19th century progressed, industrial capitalism grew stronger, competition intensified, and the hardships of the working class became harder to ignore. New thinkers emerged who believed that cooperation alone could not solve these problems. They argued that society needed a deeper understanding of economic forces and the dynamics of power. In the next part of this story, we turn to the transformations brought by the Industrial Revolution. It was a world filled with noise, smoke, and rapid movement. It was a world where inventions brought prosperity to a few and hardship to many. It was in this world that the need for a new kind of social thinking became unmistakable. The utopian socialists had offered dreams of harmony. The world that followed demanded a more precise map for navigating the turbulence ahead. The 19th century arrived with a force that reshaped every corner of society. The Industrial Revolution had been growing slowly for decades, but by the early 1800s it had become an overwhelming presence. Smoke rose from chimneys that stretched across the horizon. Railroads cut through valleys and plains. Machines filled the air with constant vibration. The world that had once moved with the pace of seasons now moved with the speed of steam and steel. People felt this change in every aspect of their lives. Many left the countryside and stepped into cities that were expanding faster than anyone could control. New factories appeared beside rivers, beside coal mines, and beside rail lines. They promised work, wages, and the possibility of a new beginning. Yet the reality inside these buildings was often harsh. Days were long, often stretching from early morning until late at night, air filled with dust and smoke. Workers stood for hours in crowded rooms where machines roared louder than voices. Families crowded into narrow streets where housing was built quickly and without care. Rooms were small. Ventilation was poor. Clean water was scarce. Illness spread easily. Parents and children worked side by side because wages were so low that families depended on every possible source of income. Many workers grew tired before adulthood. Many children never reached adulthood at all. The landscape of cities changed rapidly, and so did the patterns of life within them. In this environment, a new kind of awareness began to form. People saw wealth rise in certain hands while poverty remained in others. Factories produced goods at a pace never imagined before, yet those who operated the machines rarely enjoyed the benefits. Inventors, merchants, and industrialists gained influence. Workers, despite their essential role, had little voice in the process. This imbalance led to a growing sense that society was entering unfamiliar territory, where old rules no longer applied. The early utopian socialists had already imagined cooperative communities that could ease such burdens. But their visions now met a world that demanded more than imagination. It needed a deep understanding of how modern economies worked. The Industrial Revolution revealed forces that were new in scale and complexity. Capital concentrated rapidly. Markets expanded across continents. Production became organized around profit and efficiency. These developments created opportunities for some and hardship for many. Factories required large investments to operate. Owners needed machinery, raw materials, and access to distant markets. They took risks, and some achieved great prosperity. Workers, however, often had no choice but to accept the positions offered to them. They sold their labor as the only resource they possessed. Their wages covered basic survival, but rarely much more. Long hours left little time for rest or education. Injuries were common, and workers who suffered them often lost not only income, but also their ability to support their families. Many observers watched these changes and began to ask what kind of society was being built. They saw progress, invention, and expanding wealth. They also saw hardship, overcrowding, and a loss of traditional community support. Some worried that young workers were growing up without hope or stability. Others feared that the concentration of economic power would lead to moral decay and social unrest. Newspapers described conditions in factories. Writers visited poor neighborhoods and returned with accounts of suffering that shocked those who read them. Out of this growing awareness emerged a desire to understand the mechanics behind these transformations. Why did wealth concentrate so quickly? Why did factories depend on such long hours from their workers? Why were wages so low despite the increase in production? These questions led to new forms of social analysis. Economists studied markets and production. Philosophers examined the moral implications of modern industry. Reformers attempted to create laws on child labor, work hours, and safety. Activists formed early associations to support workers. In Britain, the heart of industrial expansion, working conditions became a topic of national debate. Parliamentary committees investigated factories. Reports grew more detailed each year. Citizens learned about children crawling under machines to clean gears while they still moved. They learned about women working night shifts in textile mills without breaks. They learned about miners who descended into tunnels before dawn and emerged long after daylight had faded. These revelations shaped early political reforms, though change came slowly. Meanwhile, workers themselves began to organize. Early trade unions formed despite legal restrictions. Members gathered secretly to avoid punishment. They discussed wages, hours, and the need for collective action. Strikes occurred in various industries, though authorities often suppressed them. Over time, however, these early efforts established a foundation for stronger labor movements. They revealed that workers shared common struggles, and that cooperation among them could create pressure for change. The Industrial Revolution also influenced the way thinkers approached the idea of society itself. If machines could transform production, perhaps ideas could transform the way people live together. The speed of technological change suggested that social change might follow a similar path. Many intellectuals believed that society could be redesigned through analysis and planning. They looked at economic structures and asked whether they served all citizens or only a portion of them. Among these thinkers were those who would bring socialism into its next phase. They rejected the purely imaginative approach of the utopian socialists and sought a deeper, more systematic understanding of the forces shaping modern life. They believed that inequality grew not simply from personal greed or moral failure, but from the structure of the economic system itself. They argued that the relationship between employers and workers created conditions that encouraged exploitation. They believed that the ownership of factories and capital had become the decisive factor in determining life outcomes. The Industrial Revolution provided the evidence that these thinkers needed. It showed how quickly societies could change. It also showed that change could bring suffering, if not guided by responsibility and fairness. Because of this, new forms of socialist thought emerged that sought to explain the underlying patterns of economic power. They were more analytical than the utopians, more focused on class relations, and more determined to propose structural solutions rather than isolated communities. The realities of industrial life played a central role in shaping their ideas. They walked through crowded streets, visited mills, observed working conditions, and listened to the frustrations of laborers. They saw how the cost of survival consumed daily life for many families. They saw how wealth and comfort collected in certain homes, while others struggled to maintain stability. They noticed that even when factories grew more productive, wages remained low. These contradictions demanded explanation. It is important to remember that this shift did not happen suddenly. The transformation of society was gradual, and so was the transformation of thought. Writers published essays that influenced a small number of readers. Activists organized workers who influenced their communities. Laws changed slowly, often after years of debate. The Industrial Revolution set the stage for these developments, but each change required effort, discussion, and the willingness to question long-established ideas. Among those who grew concerned with the direction of society were two figures whose partnership would shape the modern understanding of socialism. Their names appear frequently in history, but before they formed their well-known theories, they too were shaped by the noise, dust, and hardship of the industrial world around them. Their observations led them to conclude that the problems they saw could not be addressed by isolated experiments or charitable intentions. They believed that the structure of society itself needed to be re-examined. Before we turn to them, it is helpful to pause and take in the world they inherited. The Industrial Revolution was a time of great achievement and great suffering. It brought railways, bridges, and scientific advances that connected continents. It also brought crowded tenements, polluted air, and long days spent in factories. People marveled at the speed of progress, but worried about the cost. Families experienced new opportunities and new dangers. Workers adapted to a world that cared more about efficiency than well-being. This mixture of progress and hardship created the conditions for socialist thought to evolve from dreams into theory. The utopian socialists had imagined cooperative worlds within small communities. The next generation of thinkers would look at the entire structure of society and attempt to understand how power and production shaped human life. They would examine history not as a series of accidents, but as a pattern defined by relationships between classes. They would argue that economic structures influence culture, politics, and the development of institutions. As this part of the story comes to a close, imagine the world of factories and fire as the backdrop for new ideas. The smoke that filled industrial cities marked the beginning of a new era. It was a time when people had to rethink the meaning of work, community, and progress. In these conditions, theories that once seemed distant or idealistic gained new relevance. The need for clarity grew stronger, and the desire for fairness became more urgent. The evolution of socialist thought did not begin with a single book, a single moment, or a single voice. It grew from many places at once, shaped by the world of factories, expanding cities, and new social tensions. Yet three thinkers stand at a turning point in the 19th century. Their names are Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. They lived in different countries, came from different backgrounds, and imagined different solutions. But each played a central role in awakening modern socialist philosophy. These men did not work together or form a unified school of thought. Instead, each responded in his own way to the rapid changes unfolding in society. Their ideas were sometimes practical, sometimes imaginative, and sometimes wildly ambitious, yet all carried a simple conviction. Human beings could create more just and cooperative societies if they understood the world around them and acted with intention. Their writings formed the bridge between the moral dreams of earlier centuries and the more systematic theories that would emerge later. They did not offer complete blueprints for society, but they planted seeds that grew into many of the concepts later associated with socialism. Their voices rose during a period when society felt uncertain and unbalanced. Factories hummed in every direction, streets filled with workers who struggled to afford even the smallest comforts. Wealth gathered into the hands of a growing industrial class. These conditions made new ideas necessary. We begin with Henri de Saint-Simon, a French aristocrat who lived through the dramatic upheavals of the late 18th century. He experienced the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, and the political turbulence that followed. While many aristocrats sought stability through tradition, Saint-Simon looked in the opposite direction. He believed that society needed to adapt to the new forces shaping the modern world. For him, the future belonged not to kings or nobles, but to scientists, inventors, engineers, and workers who created useful knowledge and productive labor. Saint-Simon argued that society should be organized around merit and contribution rather than birth. He proposed that leadership should be given to those who understood how to improve living conditions through rational planning. Factories, transportation networks, education systems, and public works could all be coordinated for the benefit of everyone. In his view, the well-being of society depended on productive cooperation. He imagined a world where people would work not for personal wealth alone, but for the collective progress of humanity. His ideas inspired a school of followers known as the Saint-Simonians. They promoted the idea that modern industry could be guided by enlightened administrators who would ensure fairness and efficiency. They believed that poverty was not a natural condition, but a problem created by poor organization and outdated structures. Their influence spread across France, shaping debates on economics, engineering, and social reform. They even contributed to early discussions about public infrastructure, including railroads and sanitation systems. Saint-Simon's vision was not without challenges. Critics argued that placing society in the hands of experts risked creating new forms of hierarchy. Supporters countered that expertise and knowledge were necessary to manage complex modern economies. Regardless of these debates, his central idea took hold. The concept that society could be improved through planning, coordination, and the guidance of skilled individuals became an important part of early socialist thought. Where Saint-Simon approached society through rational analysis, Charles Fourier approached it through imagination. Fourier lived in a France transformed by commerce and industry, yet he found the modern world deeply unsatisfying. He saw alienation everywhere. Workers performed monotonous tasks. Families struggled with limited resources. Communities felt fragmented. Fourier believed that society ignored the natural passions and talents that shaped human behavior. He proposed an entirely new arrangement of life that would restore harmony between individuals and communities. Fourier imagined cooperative communities called phalansteries. Each phalanstery would house about 1,600 people, living and working together in a large residential complex. Jobs would be assigned according to personal interests and natural inclinations. Children would receive education that matched their unique personalities. Meals would be communal. Property would be partly shared and partly private. Fourier believed that work could become enjoyable if people were allowed to choose tasks that suited them. He criticized the competitive nature of modern society, arguing that it produced unnecessary conflict and unhappiness. He believed that cooperation, when organized with careful attention to human psychology, could bring out the best in people. Fourier extended his ideas to agriculture, industry, and domestic life. He believed that even small changes to the organization of society could produce significant improvements in well-being. Many of Fourier's predictions ventured into realms that seemed improbable. He described elaborate social rituals, unique architectural designs, and even transformations in natural phenomena. Yet beneath these imaginative details lay a serious attempt to address the emotional and social needs of ordinary people. Fourier recognized that inequality was not the only problem. He also believed that modern life often left people feeling isolated and unfulfilled. His solution aimed at creating environments where emotional and social satisfaction were as important as material security. Supporters of Fourier attempted to create phalansteries in France, America, and other countries. Some communities lasted only a short time. Others survived for several years. They often struggled with financial difficulties, internal disagreements, and practical challenges. Yet the experiments showed that people were willing to test new forms of social living. Fourier's influence extended beyond these communities. His ideas contributed to later discussions about cooperative housing, communal kitchens, shared childcare, and the design of work environments. Robert Owen offers a different perspective. Born in Wales to modest circumstances, he became a successful industrialist through discipline, dedication, and a keen understanding of business. Unlike many factory owners of his time, Owen believed that workers deserved dignity and education. He argued that the environment shaped human character. Poverty, ignorance, and hardship were not the result of moral weakness, but of circumstances that could be improved through thoughtful planning. Owen managed a cotton mill in New Lanark, Scotland, where he introduced reforms that drew international attention. He reduced working hours, improved housing, and built schools for children. He banned the employment of young children in dangerous conditions. He created affordable stores where goods were sold at fair prices. Visitors from across Europe traveled to New Lanark to witness these reforms. Many describe the village as an example of what industry could become if guided by compassion and responsibility. Encouraged by his success, Owen proposed the creation of new cooperative settlements. These communities would combine industry and agriculture, ensuring that workers received fair wages and meaningful education. He believed that cooperation could replace competition, and that society could be restructured to promote the well-being of all its members. Owen attempted to establish such communities in Britain and the United States. Some succeeded for a time. Others dissolved due to disagreements or financial strain. Yet each attempt contributed to growing interest in cooperative movements. Owen's ideas inspired many to form early trade unions, cooperative stores, and worker associations. His belief that society could be shaped through education and environment influenced future reforms in labor laws, public schooling, and workplace safety. Owen became a symbol of the idea that industry could be humane and that workers deserve respect. Together, Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen created the foundation for modern socialist thought. Their ideas differed significantly, yet they shared certain principles. They believed that society should be organized to serve the needs of all its members. They believed that cooperation could replace destructive competition. They believed that economic life could be planned to produce fairness and stability. They believed that poverty and suffering were not inevitable, but were the result of changeable social arrangements. Their work inspired future generations, even those who later criticized or rejected parts of their vision. The utopian socialists demonstrated that alternative forms of society were imaginable. They challenged the assumption that industrial capitalism represented the final stage of human development. They opened the door for more rigorous analysis of economic systems and class relations. In the decades that followed, a new generation of thinkers emerged. They admired the moral spirit of the utopian socialists, but believed that a deeper, scientific understanding of society was needed. These new thinkers argued that history moved through identifiable patterns shaped by economic forces. They believed that class conflict played a central role in shaping institutions and political structures. They believed that the problems of industrial society were not simply moral or emotional, but structural. As this chapter closes, imagine these three thinkers as early lights guiding the path toward more detailed theories. They lived in different times, wrote different kinds of works, and addressed different problems. Yet their ideas helped to transform curiosity into analysis and hope into philosophy. Their dreams were not always practical, yet their courage to imagine better worlds left an imprint on the history of social thought. The next chapter in the story of socialism begins in the quiet reading rooms of 19th century libraries. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the world, and its changes were too deep to be explained by imagination alone. Factories continued to expand. Cities kept growing upward and outward. Railroads connected regions that had once felt distant. Every year, new machines replaced old ways of living. The speed of progress impressed many, yet the human cost continued to rise. Amid this world of movement and noise, two thinkers sat down to study the forces shaping society. Their names were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They lived in an age when political conflicts were intense, intellectual circles were lively, and ideas flowed from one country to another with increasing speed. They believed that society could only be understood by examining the structure of economic life, the purpose of production, and the relationships between different classes. Their partnership became one of the most influential collaborations in the history of social thought. Marx was born in Germany and grew up in a world shaped by political upheaval. He studied philosophy and law, absorbing the ideas of earlier thinkers who questioned the nature of power, freedom, and economic life. He traveled through Europe, wrote for radical newspapers, and challenged the political order of his time. His work often brought attention from authorities, forcing him to move from one city to another. These experiences shaped his understanding of political conflict and the struggles faced by ordinary people. Engels came from a different background. His family owned factories in Germany and England, and he spent much of his youth exposed to the realities of industrial production. He observed workers living in crowded neighborhoods near textile mills. He learned about the dangers and hardships inside factories. He saw the long hours and low wages that defined the lives of many laborers. His experiences convinced him that industrial society contained deep injustices that could not be solved through charity or small reforms. Their partnership began in the 1840s, when both men recognized that they shared similar concerns about capitalism and its effects. Their early discussions revealed a shared belief that society was shaped by economic structures rather than by individual intentions alone. They agreed that the problems faced by workers were not simply personal or moral issues, but reflected the larger organization of production. This belief pushed them to develop a new approach to understanding history and society. Marx and Engels argued that economic life formed the foundation of all social relations. They believed that the way goods were produced, distributed, and owned determined the structure of society. In their view, history moved through stages defined by the relationships between different classes. These relationships were shaped by material conditions and the division of labor. They studied societies from ancient times to the modern era and identified patterns that revealed how social systems had evolved. One of their most influential ideas was the concept of class struggle. They argued that each stage of history produced groups with conflicting interests. In feudal societies, the struggle was between lords and peasants. In early modern societies, it appeared between guildmasters and apprentices. In industrial capitalism, the primary conflict was between the bourgeoisie, who owned factories and capital, and the proletariat, who sold their labor to survive. Marx and Engels believed that these conflicts shaped political institutions, cultural norms, and social development. Their work did not focus on personal morality. Instead, they looked at structural forces. They argued that capitalism, despite its achievements, created instability. They believed it produced cycles of economic crisis, periods of overproduction, and deep inequality. They saw workers living in difficult conditions while industrialists accumulated wealth. They observed how technology increased productivity, yet wages remained low. They concluded that capitalism contained internal tensions that would eventually lead to significant social change. Marx and Engels spent countless hours in libraries, reading economic texts, analyzing political history, and studying the development of industries. The British Museum in London became one of Marx's most important workplaces. He sat at wooden tables covered in books, taking detailed notes as he examined data on wages, prices, markets, and trade. These long sessions shaped much of his later writings. The quiet rooms and steady light offered a space for reflection near the heart of the rapidly expanding industrial world. In 1848, Marx and Engels wrote one of their most famous works, a short yet powerful text published during a year of widespread revolutions across Europe. It presented their view of history, class relations, and the dynamics of capitalism. The document stated that the history of all societies was a history of class struggles, and that the working class would eventually gain the awareness and strength to challenge the existing system. Although brief, the text captured the urgency of the time and the hope that social transformation was possible. Their ideas spread slowly at first. Many resisted their interpretations. Others misunderstood their arguments. Yet their work reached those who were searching for explanations that matched the realities they saw around them. Workers who read their writings recognized familiar struggles in the descriptions of factory life. Students and intellectuals saw a comprehensive theory of history. Activists found a language that expressed their frustrations with inequality and exploitation. Marx continued his studies for decades, writing large volumes that examined the inner workings of capitalism. He analyzed how markets functioned, how capital grew, and how labor created value. He believed that capitalism relied on the extraction of surplus value from workers, meaning that the profits of industrialists came from a portion of labor that was not paid for. He argued that this structure created a fundamental imbalance between owners and workers. Engels supported Marx financially and contributed his own writings to the development of their shared ideas. He wrote about the conditions of workers in England, described the role of the state in protecting economic interests, and explored how political institutions reflected class relations. He became a bridge between the growing socialist movement and the world of industrial business, using his knowledge of both to sharpen their analysis. Their partnership was built on long discussions, careful reading, and mutual respect. They disagreed at times, refined their ideas, and responded to criticism. They believed that socialism needed a clear theoretical foundation. They admired the utopian socialists for their compassion, yet they argued that imagination alone could not solve the problems of the modern world. They believed that only a scientific understanding of society could guide meaningful change. The influence of Marx and Engels grew after their deaths as their writings circulated more widely. Some readers embraced their ideas enthusiastically. Others adapted them to suit local conditions. Still others rejected parts of their work while accepting certain insights. Their theories sparked movements in countries across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Political parties formed around their ideas. Labor unions adopted portions of their analysis. Debates spread into universities, meeting halls, and factories. It is important to remember that Marx and Engels lived in a specific time, shaped by the early phases of industrial capitalism. Their theories responded to the conditions they observed, and those conditions were often severe. Factories lacked protections. Labor laws were scarce. Child labor was common. Public health systems were limited. Housing was overcrowded. Inequality was widespread and visible. Their writings reflected the stark contrast between wealth and suffering, progress and hardship. Their contributions to socialist thought were immense. They provided a framework for understanding economic dynamics. They offered a historical perspective that connected past societies to modern industrial life. They introduced concepts that would shape political debates for generations. They placed emphasis on structural forces rather than individual failures, encouraging people to examine the roots of social problems. Marx and Engels did not create socialism, but they gave it a new depth. Their work transformed a broad set of hopes and experiments into a coherent theory. They believed that the development of industry created both the conditions for inequality and the possibility of a more rational and cooperative society. Their ideas challenged the assumption that capitalism represented the final form of economic life. As this chapter closes, imagine the quiet of the reading room where Marx worked, surrounded by volumes of economic records and historical texts. The world outside moved quickly, filled with workers, carriages, and the constant hum of industry. Inside, ideas formed slowly, as the two thinkers studied the connections between work, wealth, and power. Their partnership left a legacy that continues to shape conversations about society, justice, and the structure of economies. The ideas developed by early socialist thinkers did not remain within libraries or the pages of philosophical texts. They moved outward, carried by workers, writers, activists, and ordinary people who saw their own lives reflected in the descriptions of hardship and inequality. The 19th century became a time when these ideas took their first organized steps into public life. Movements began to form, each shaped by local conditions, national politics, and the daily struggles of working people. The result was a rich and diverse landscape of early socialist activity that stretched across Europe and beyond. This was a century defined by change. Cities continued to grow rapidly. Factories expanded their operations. Railways connected distant regions, and goods traveled faster than ever before. These developments created new opportunities, but they also deepened inequalities. In many industrial cities, workers lived in crowded neighborhoods near the mills and workshops that employed them. Rooms were small, often shared by multiple families. Streets lacked sanitation. Water was often unsafe. Hospitals were limited and costly. These conditions created a sense of vulnerability that many workers carried with them each day. The industrial world also changed the nature of work. Jobs became more specialized. Tasks often involved repeating the same motion for hours. Workers had little control over their time or the pace of production. Wages were low and unstable. When economic downturns struck, factories closed and workers were dismissed without warning. Many families lacked savings and depended entirely on weekly wages. A single illness, an injury, or a factory closure could lead to immediate hardship. These experiences formed the backdrop for the first waves of socialist movements. People began to gather not only to discuss their difficulties, but to imagine ways of improving their lives. Early meetings took place in taverns, rented halls, or private homes. Newspapers dedicated to worker interests started to appear. Pamphlets circulated through neighborhoods, carrying ideas to those who had little access to formal education. Speakers traveled from one city to another, addressing gatherings of workers who listened intently as they heard their own struggles described with clarity and purpose. One of the earliest organized efforts was the formation of workers' associations. These groups were not yet unions in the modern sense, but they offered a space for workers to share information, discuss conditions, and provide mutual support. They sometimes established small libraries, held lectures, or organized community events. Their purpose was to strengthen solidarity among workers who often felt isolated in their struggles. These associations taught members the importance of collective action, even when the laws of the time restricted their activities. As the century progressed, early trade unions began to emerge. In Britain, where industrialization had advanced rapidly, skilled workers formed associations to protect wages and working conditions. These groups were initially small and faced strong opposition from factory owners and government officials. Strikes were sometimes met with legal action or force, and workers risked losing their jobs if they participated. But despite these challenges, unions continued to grow because workers recognized that they were stronger together than alone. Many early socialists played important roles in these efforts. They wrote articles explaining the causes of inequality. They supported workers during strikes. They urged governments to create laws that protected workers from exploitation. The writings of Marx and Engels influenced some of these early movements, offering a framework that explained why conditions were so difficult and why collective action could lead to change. However, not all early socialists agreed with Marx and Engels. The socialist landscape was diverse, filled with competing ideas and strategies. One example of this diversity can be seen in the rise of democratic socialist movements. These groups believed that workers could achieve greater justice through political reform rather than through revolution. They advocated for voting rights, social welfare programs, and stronger labor laws. In countries with emerging parliamentary systems, democratic socialists sought to form political parties that represented the interests of workers. They argued that social change could happen through peaceful, gradual progress. In Germany, this approach gained strong support. Workers faced strict conditions in factories, yet they also lived in a society that was gradually opening space for political participation. Activists founded groups dedicated to improving the life of the working class through both economic and political means. Newspapers played an important role. They published editorials, reported on strikes, and debated ideas from across Europe. They helped shape public opinion and gave workers a voice they had long been denied. At the same time, more radical organizations emerged. Some believed that political systems would never grant meaningful rights to workers because they were shaped by the interests of wealthy industrialists. These activists argued that workers should build their own institutions, separate from existing political structures. They organized cooperatives, mutual aid societies, and community groups that provided essential services. These groups demonstrated that workers could manage resources cooperatively and support one another without relying on wealthy elites. Another branch of early socialist thought was shaped by the ideas of anarchism. Anarchist thinkers believed that authority itself was the root of social problems. They argued that true freedom required dismantling institutions of power, including the state, large corporations, and hierarchical organizations. Their ideas appealed to workers who had experienced oppression from both employers and governments. Anarchist movements grew rapidly in parts of Europe, especially in France, Spain, and Italy, where political tensions were high. The relationship between socialists and anarchists was often complex. They shared a desire to create a fairer society, but disagreed on how to achieve it. Some believed that political participation was essential. Others argued that political institutions would always protect the interests of the wealthy. Debates between these groups were intense, yet they also contributed to a vibrant intellectual environment. They sharpened arguments, inspired new strategies, and encouraged activists to think carefully about the meaning of justice and freedom. As these movements evolved, they began to influence broader society. Governments grew concerned as strikes increased in number and size. Newspapers reported on large gatherings of workers demanding better wages and safer conditions. Middle-class citizens discussed these issues in cafes, universities, and salons. Some sympathized with workers and supported reforms. Others feared instability and sought to preserve existing institutions. These tensions shaped the politics of the century and motivated leaders to consider new laws and regulations. Despite disagreements among early socialist groups, they shared several core beliefs. They believed that workers deserved dignity and fair treatment. They believed that economic life should serve the well-being of all members of society. They believed that inequality could be reduced through collective effort, public policy, and social cooperation. These shared values united them, even when their strategies differed. The first international effort to bring together workers and socialist activists appeared in 1864. Representatives from various countries gathered in London to form an organization dedicated to cooperation among working people across national borders. They believed that the struggles faced by workers in one country were connected to struggles in others. They sought to share ideas, coordinate support during strikes, and build solidarity among movements that often worked in isolation. This organization became known as the First International. It brought together socialists, anarchists, union leaders, and intellectuals. Meetings were filled with debate. Members argued about strategy, philosophy, and political goals. Despite disagreements, the First International demonstrated that the working class had begun to see itself as part of a larger global movement. This international perspective influenced later socialist parties and labor unions, helping them understand that economic forces cross national boundaries. However, the First International eventually dissolved due to internal conflicts. Disagreements between Marxists, anarchists, and other factions grew too strong to manage within one organization, yet its legacy lived on. It inspired later international movements and showed that cooperation across borders was possible. It also revealed the complexity of socialist thought and the need for clear goals and careful organization. By the late 19th century, socialist political parties began to form across Europe. These parties grew steadily as workers gained the right to vote in many countries. They campaigned for shorter workdays, safer factories, public education, pensions, and rights for women and children. They influenced national debates and helped shape new laws. Some of these parties became powerful political forces, partnering with labor unions to advocate for reforms that improved daily life for millions of people. As this century drew toward its end, socialism had taken many forms. It had moved beyond philosophy and entered the world of labor, politics, and social reform. It had inspired experiments, protests, and organizations. It had also sparked conflicts and disagreements. Yet through all these developments, the central questions remained the same. How should society be structured? How should wealth be shared? How can workers gain dignity and security in a rapidly changing world? As this part closes, imagine the streets of 19th century cities. They are filled with workers leaving factories at dusk, their voices echoing through narrow alleys. Meeting halls glow with lamplight as activists gather to plan their next steps. Newspapers pass from hand to hand, carrying stories of strikes, debates, and new ideas spreading across continents. In these scenes, we see the first real waves of socialism taking shape. They are waves that rise from the hardships of daily life and move toward a future shaped by hope, determination, and the belief that society can be more just. As socialist ideas spread through the 19th century, they gathered people from different backgrounds who shared a desire for justice and dignity. Workers joined movements because they felt the hardships of factory life. Intellectuals joined because they saw deep inequalities in the modern world. Activists joined because they believed that society could be reshaped through collective effort. Yet, even as the movement grew, it became clear that unity would not last forever. Different groups imagined different paths forward. Each brought its own philosophy, strategy, and understanding of power. By the late 19th century, these differences had grown strong enough to divide the movement. The split did not occur suddenly. It developed slowly through debates, disagreements, and contrasting visions for the future. Yet the impact would shape socialist history for generations. The first major division formed between those who believed in political action through existing institutions and those who rejected political systems altogether. On one side, some socialists argued that workers should form parties, participate in elections, and push for reforms through parliaments and representative bodies. They believed that governments could become instruments of progress if workers gained enough influence. On the other side, others insisted that political systems were built to protect the interests of the wealthy and could never truly reflect the needs of ordinary people. They argued that real change required creating new forms of social organization outside the state. Anarchists became the most vocal critics of political participation. They believed that authority itself created oppression. Governments, they argued, concentrated power in the hands of a few. They believed that even well-intentioned laws could become tools of control. For them, freedom meant living in communities where decisions were made collectively and voluntarily. They imagined societies built on cooperation rather than coercion, where workers managed their own workplaces and communities without relying on centralized institutions. These ideas attracted many who felt the weight of state power in their daily lives. In parts of Europe, especially in France, Spain, and Italy, governments often suppressed worker movements, censored newspapers, and used police forces to break strikes. Under such conditions, the anarchist belief that authority was a root cause of suffering resonated deeply. Workers who experienced violence, discrimination, or poverty often concluded that governments served the interests of industrialists rather than the people. Yet anarchism was not a single unified ideology. Some anarchists emphasized peaceful cooperation, education, and voluntary association. Others believed that resistance to oppressive systems required direct action, including strikes, boycotts, and, in rare cases, violent acts against symbols of authority. These differing strategies led to tension within the anarchist movement itself. Still, the core belief remained consistent. Societies should be built through mutual aid, free cooperation, and the absence of centralized power. Marxists approached the problem differently. Marx and Engels believed that the state played a complex role in modern societies. They argued that political institutions reflected the interests of the dominant class. Yet they also believed that the state could eventually become a tool for the working class. They described the state as an arena of struggle rather than an unchangeable structure. Marxists believed that workers could use political power to transform economic structures and pave the way for a more equal society. This difference in perspective created ongoing debates. Marxists criticized anarchists for rejecting political action, arguing that doing so weakened workers' ability to achieve tangible reforms. They believed that organized political parties were essential to challenging the power of industrialists and landowners. Anarchists, in turn, argued that Marxists relied too heavily on structures that had long been instruments of oppression. They warned that any movement that seized political power risked becoming authoritarian. These debates intensified within the First International, the organization created to unite workers' movements across national borders. The International brought together activists, intellectuals, and trade unionists. Meetings were filled with passionate arguments about strategy. Some members believed that the International should focus on supporting strikes and improving labor organization. Others believed it should establish political parties that represented workers' interests. Still others insisted that the movement should avoid political systems entirely and focus on building new forms of social cooperation. Over time, disagreements between Marxists and anarchists became too strong to contain within one organization. Their visions of the future were too different. Their strategies could not be reconciled. By the early 1870s, tensions reached a breaking point. Marx supporters and anarchist supporters clashed over leadership, goals, and the direction of the movement. Marx believed that the International needed strong coordination and clear political objectives. Anarchist leaders, including Mikhail Bakunin, argued that centralized leadership contradicted the very idea of worker autonomy. The conflict between Marx and Bakunin became symbolic of the broader struggle. Both men were committed to improving the lives of workers, yet their methods could not have been more different. Marx focused on analyzing economic structures and building political movements capable of challenging existing power. Bakunin focused on dismantling authority itself and empowering communities to govern their own affairs. Their disagreements shaped the final years of the First International, which eventually dissolved under the pressure of internal conflict. The split between Marxists and anarchists marked a turning point. Movements across Europe aligned themselves with one approach or the other. In some regions, anarchists gained strong support among rural workers and artisans who valued autonomy and distrusted centralized institutions. In others, Marxists gained influence through political parties that sought to win representation and pass reforms. The division also influenced the development of trade unions, cooperatives, and worker associations, each choosing strategies that reflected their underlying philosophy. Another significant division emerged between revolutionary socialists and reformist socialists. Revolutionary socialists believed that capitalism could not be reformed. They argued that the structures of private ownership, wage labor, and market competition would always produce inequality. For them, the only path to a fair society involved a dramatic transformation of the economic system. They believed this transformation required mass movements, organized struggle, and, in some cases, uprisings against existing governments. Reformist socialists approached the issue differently. They believed that improvements could be introduced gradually through laws, regulations, and democratic processes. They saw voting rights, social welfare programs, public education, and workplace protections as essential tools for reducing inequality. Reformists argued that these changes could lift communities out of poverty, create stability, and expand opportunities for workers. They believed that society could evolve peacefully toward greater equality without the need for abrupt or violent change. These two approaches developed in parallel. Reformists gained influence in countries with expanding voting rights and parliamentary systems. Revolutionary groups gained support where political systems resisted change, or where workers faced severe oppression. The contrast between these strategies created dynamic political environments across Europe. Debates grew more intense as parties, unions, and community groups aligned themselves with one approach or the other. These early divisions did not weaken the overall growth of socialist movements. Instead, they expanded the richness of their ideas. They pushed activists to consider the nature of power, the role of the state, and the best path toward justice. They forced movements to examine their own priorities, values, and long-term goals. They encouraged experiments with cooperatives, political campaigns, mass strikes, union organizing, and community-based projects. Despite these differences, socialists across the 19th century shared several key beliefs. They agreed that workers deserved better conditions. They believed that society could be improved through collective effort. They recognized that economic systems shaped daily life in profound ways. They acknowledged that wealth and power were unevenly distributed, and that these imbalances required attention. They held to the idea that ordinary people should have a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The 19th century closed with socialist movements more active than ever. The split between Marxists and anarchists remained unresolved, yet both continued to inspire workers. Reformist and revolutionary groups continued to argue about methods, yet both sought solutions to the same problems. Across Europe and beyond, socialist parties gained members. Trade unions grew stronger. Cooperatives spread through communities. The first international organizations laid the foundation for future cooperation. As this chapter closes, imagine the meeting halls where these debates took place. Wooden tables held pamphlets, notes, and half-drunk cups of coffee. Workers gathered after long shifts to listen, argue, and plan. Activists spoke with passion about paths forward. each convinced that their strategy held the key to a better world. These early disagreements shaped the future of socialism, not by weakening the movement, but by forcing it to examine itself carefully. The questions raised during this period would echo through the 20th century, influencing revolutions, political parties, and social reforms across the globe. The 20th century opened with a world that felt restless. Industrial cities had grown to sizes no one had imagined a few generations earlier. Empires governed vast territories, while social tensions deepened inside their borders. Workers faced unpredictable wages, rising prices, and long workdays. Peasants in many countries lived with debts and burdens inherited from older systems. Intellectuals debated the meaning of justice and progress. Politicians wondered how long the established order could survive. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, one country stood on the edge of a transformation that would reshape global history. Russia, at the start of the century, remained a deeply unequal society. Its empire stretched across continents, yet its internal structure was fragile. A small elite held political and economic power, while the majority lived in rural areas, working land that often yielded only enough for survival. Industrialization had begun late compared to Western Europe, and factories were concentrated in a few cities. The workers who filled them faced difficult conditions, long hours, and limited rights. Many lacked access to education, healthcare, or stable housing. Political opposition was restricted, and public criticism of the government often led to punishment. These conditions created an environment where socialist ideas found eager listeners. Workers who read socialist pamphlets or attended small meetings recognized their own lives in the descriptions of exploitation. Students in universities discussed socialism with growing interest, seeing it as a path toward modernization and justice. Intellectuals debated complex theories of class and power, analyzing how societies might be rebuilt on new foundations. Meanwhile, revolutionary groups formed in secret, meeting in apartments, basements, and cafes to plan strategies for change. Russia had already experienced political unrest before the major revolution. In 1905, widespread protests, strikes, and uprisings erupted across the empire. Workers demanded better wages and hours. Peasants demanded land reforms. Ethnic minorities demanded rights long denied to them. The government struggled to respond. Although the revolt eventually subsided, it revealed deep dissatisfaction throughout the empire. Many believed that the old system could not endure much longer. Within this environment, different socialist factions attempted to influence the direction of change. Some believed that Russia needed gradual reforms and a stronger parliament. Others argued that only a complete transformation could address the deep-rooted problems of society. Among these groups was the Bolshevik faction, led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin studied Marxist theory closely and believed that Russia's unique conditions required an organized, disciplined party capable of guiding the working class toward revolution. He argued that only a determined group of activists could overcome the power of the state and the influence of the elite. During these years, many Bolshevik leaders lived in exile across Europe. They wrote articles, debated strategies, and communicated with supporters inside Russia through underground channels. Their work required constant caution. Letters were coded, books were smuggled. Meetings moved from one location to another to avoid interception. The movement grew slowly, shaped by long nights of discussion and a shared belief that Russia was approaching a moment of historic change. That moment arrived in 1917. Russia was fighting in the First World War, a conflict that placed enormous strain on the country. Soldiers faced shortages of supplies. Civilians endured rising food prices and declining wages. Factories worked in difficult conditions, while inflation reduced the value of earnings. Hunger spread in some regions. Public frustration grew stronger each month. Protests began with ordinary workers demanding bread and peace. Soon they expanded into mass demonstrations, calling for deeper change. By early spring, the old government collapsed. A provisional government formed to replace it, promising reforms and attempting to establish stability. At first, many hoped this new administration would guide Russia toward a more democratic future. But the challenges facing the country were immense. The war continued. Economic conditions worsened. Land reforms were delayed. Workers and soldiers felt unheard. The provisional government struggled to address multiple crises at once. During this period, socialist groups expanded their influence. Workers formed councils, known as Soviets, to discuss their needs and coordinate actions. Soldiers formed similar councils inside military units. These groups became important centers of political debate. Within them, Bolshevik ideas began to gain more support. Lenin returned from exile and argued that the provisional government could not meet the demands of workers and peasants. He declared that the Soviets should become the basis of a new political order. As months passed, tensions grew, strikes increased. Soldiers deserted the front lines. Peasants took control of land as local authority weakened. The provisional government lost credibility. The Bolsheviks gained seats in councils and won support from those who felt desperate for immediate solutions. By autumn, Bolshevik leaders believed that conditions were ripe for a decisive action. They planned an uprising that would remove the provisional government and transfer power to the Soviets. The October Revolution, as it came to be known, unfolded quickly. Bolshevik forces seized key locations in Petrograd, including communication centers, government buildings, and transportation hubs. The provisional government fell with limited resistance. Soon, a new administration announced sweeping changes. Land would be redistributed. Factories would be managed with greater worker involvement. The country would withdraw from the war. These announcements inspired hope among many and fear among others. The world looked on with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. The revolution marked the first time in history that a government based on socialist principles gained control of a major nation. The new leadership believed that Russia would become an example for the world, demonstrating that workers could govern themselves and transform society. They envisioned an economy organized for public benefit rather than private profit. They imagined a system where resources would be shared, inequality reduced, and ordinary people given a voice. Yet the years that followed became far more complex than the early leaders expected. Russia soon descended into civil war, as different factions fought for control. Foreign armies entered the conflict, hoping to influence its outcome. Economic life collapsed in many regions. Cities faced shortages of food and fuel. Factories halted production. Transportation networks were damaged. Millions suffered as violence spread across the country. The Civil War forced the new government to adopt strict measures to maintain control and direct resources. These measures included centralized planning, rationing, and the use of force to ensure compliance. Some argued that these policies were necessary to survive the chaos. Others believed they betrayed the original ideals of the revolution. After several years of fighting, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. The Soviet Union was established in 1922, becoming the first country to describe itself as a socialist state. The creation of the Soviet Union inspired movements around the world. Many saw it as proof that a society based on socialist principles could be formed despite immense obstacles. Activists in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas followed events closely. Some joined parties that supported the Soviet model. Others sought to adapt socialist ideas to local conditions. The revolution changed global politics, prompting governments to reconsider labor laws, welfare programs, and social policies. At the same time, the Soviet experiment raised difficult questions. How much power should a government hold during a social transformation? How could workers participate meaningfully in decision-making within a large and complex society? How could equality be ensured without suppressing freedom? These questions did not have simple answers, and the decades that followed revealed both achievements and struggles inside the Soviet Union. For now, we leave the story at its beginning. The Russian Revolution marked a turning point not only in socialist history but in world history. It showed that ideas born in factories, meetings, and books could grow into movements capable of reshaping nations. It also revealed the challenges of turning theory into practice, especially during times of conflict and crisis. As this chapter closes, imagine the streets of Petrograd in 1917. Crowds gather in the cold, their voices rising in anticipation. Soldiers and workers stand together, holding banners that speak of land, peace, and a new beginning. Snow falls lightly on buildings where decisions are being made that will echo across the world. In this moment, hope and uncertainty mix in equal measure. A new path has opened, but the direction it will lead remains unclear. The Russian Revolution sent a long echo across the world. It carried a message that society could be redesigned, that old systems could be challenged, and that workers and peasants could take part in shaping their destiny. Whether admired or feared, the event awakened governments, movements, and ordinary citizens to the possibility of deep social change. Yet socialism did not spread in one direction or follow one model. It took different forms in different places, shaped by unique histories, cultures, and struggles. As the 20th century unfolded, countries across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America began to interpret socialist ideas through their own experiences. Some saw socialism as a path out of colonial rule. Others saw it as a way to modernize economies that were trapped in poverty. Still others saw it as a means to challenge local elites and redistribute power. These movements rarely followed the exact steps of the Russian experiment. Instead, they blended socialist principles with local traditions, political conditions, and social needs. We begin in China, a country whose size, history, and diversity created challenges entirely unlike those faced in Russia. In the early 20th century, China was still recovering from the fall of its imperial dynasty. Warlords controlled territory. Foreign powers held influence over ports and trade. Peasants faced famine, heavy taxes, and limited access to land. Cities grew rapidly, while rural areas remained deeply impoverished. In this environment, different political movements emerged, each offering a vision for the country's future. One of these movements was inspired by Marxist ideas, but adapted them to China's unique conditions. The Chinese Communist Party formed in the 1920s, initially small and focused on urban workers. Yet China was overwhelmingly rural, and its leaders soon recognized that lasting change required engaging with the vast population of peasants. Under the leadership of figures such as Mao Zedong, the movement drew strength from rural communities. They emphasized land reform, community organization, and local councils. During decades of conflict, including civil war and foreign invasion, the movement grew steadily. Peasants joined not because of abstract theory, but because of concrete promises. They wanted land, stability, and protection from the power of landlords. When the revolution succeeded in 1949, China embarked on a path described as socialist, but deeply shaped by its own context. Land was redistributed, collective farms were established, and political campaigns sought to reshape society. Over time, China's approach evolved through difficult experiments, dramatic campaigns, and later economic reforms that blended market activity with state control. Its path remains one of the most complex examples of how socialism took root beyond Europe. Across Asia, other countries also explored forms of socialism. In Vietnam, decades of foreign occupation and conflict created a strong desire for independence. Leaders embraced socialist ideas as they fought for freedom and unity. They believed that land reform, collective action, and central planning could help rebuild a country exhausted by war. In North Korea, Soviet influence shaped a different model, marked by strict centralization and heavy emphasis on state authority. Each country followed its own approach, showing how local histories shaped the meaning of socialism. Turning to Europe, socialism developed along multiple paths. In some countries, socialist parties entered government through democratic elections, advocating for social welfare programs, public healthcare, pensions, and education. These movements believed that socialism could be achieved through gradual reform rather than revolution. They worked within parliamentary systems to expand rights and improve living conditions. Over time, they helped build the foundation for modern welfare states, especially in Scandinavia, where strong social policies became a hallmark of national life. In other parts of Europe, revolutionary movements gained influence, especially during periods of crisis. Economic depressions, wars, and political instability created environments where radical solutions attracted support. Some groups attempted uprisings, while others participated in coalitions that sought to challenge conservative governments. The early decades of the 20th century were filled with attempts to balance reformist and revolutionary strategies. These tensions shaped political systems and social debates across the continent. Socialism also found fertile ground in Latin America. Many countries in the region had long histories of inequality, where wealth and land were concentrated in the hands of a few. Peasants, indigenous communities, and urban workers often lived with limited access to resources, education, or political representation. When socialist ideas reached these regions, they merged with local demands for land reform, national sovereignty, and protection against foreign influence. In Mexico, early 20th century revolutions introduced land redistribution and public investment in social programs. Later, countries like Chile, Cuba, and Nicaragua pursued different forms of socialism. Each movement reflected the region's specific challenges. Cuba's revolution, in 1959, led by Fidel Castro, produced a government that embraced state planning, universal education, and public healthcare. Chile, under Salvador Allende, attempted a democratic path towards socialism, focusing on nationalization of industry and expansion of social welfare. Nicaragua, during the Sandinista movement, combined socialist aspirations with campaigns for literacy and rural development. These experiments produced a mix of achievements, setbacks, and controversies. Education expanded. Healthcare became more accessible. Income inequality sometimes decreased. At the same time, political tensions rose, economic challenges emerged, and external pressures shaped each movement's trajectory. In many countries, foreign governments intervened out of fear that socialism would spread. These interventions often intensified conflict and shaped the outcomes of local struggles. In Africa, socialist ideas arrived at a moment when many nations were fighting for independence from colonial rule. Leaders believed that socialism could offer a path toward unity, development, and justice. They saw it as a break from systems imposed by colonial powers. Many countries adopted forms of African socialism, emphasizing community, tradition, and shared responsibility. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere promoted a vision based on rural development and cooperative villages. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah sought rapid modernization, guided by state planning. Across the continent, socialism became linked with national liberation movements that sought to reclaim resources and strengthen local control. These efforts faced immense challenges. Colonial administrations had left behind fragmented infrastructures, uneven development, and limited access to education. New governments struggled to balance ambitious plans with economic realities. Some countries achieved improvements in literacy and healthcare. Others faced political instability, external pressure, or internal disagreements that slowed progress. Despite these difficulties, the aspiration for an equitable society remained a powerful force in the early decades of African independence. As socialism spread across continents, it continued to take different shapes. In some regions, it became a framework for modernization. In others, it became a response to poverty, inequality, or foreign influence. In still others, it became a tool for political organization and national unity. The diversity of these experiments showed that socialism was not a single model. It was a collection of ideas that could be adapted in many ways. Yet these movements also revealed the challenges of applying theory to real societies. Central planning often proved difficult in large countries with diverse needs. Land reform created tensions between communities. Industrial development required resources that some nations lacked. Political conflicts arose when different factions disagreed on priorities. International pressures added further complexity, as global powers often intervened in conflicts to protect their own interests. Despite these obstacles, socialist ideas left lasting marks in many places. Public education expanded in regions where it had been limited. Healthcare systems reached populations that had long been underserved. Land reform improved the lives of peasants in some countries. Illiteracy declined. Infrastructure improved. Social safety nets grew stronger. Even in countries that later shifted away from state-centered socialism, these achievements remained part of their national development. The middle of the 20th century opened with a world scarred by immense conflict. The Second World War had shaken nations to their core. Cities lay in ruins. Families carried memories of loss that would never fade. Entire regions faced hunger, displacement, and economic collapse. Borders shifted as defeated empires dissolved and new nations emerged. In this landscape of uncertainty, two powerful systems rose to define global politics. One was based on capitalism and liberal democracy. The other was rooted in socialism as interpreted by the Soviet Union. Their rivalry shaped decades of history, influencing nations across every continent. The Soviet Union emerged from the war with enormous losses and enormous influence. Millions had died. Yet the country had helped defeat a common enemy and gained a reputation for resilience. Its government believed that the sacrifices made during the war justified a central role in shaping the world's future. The United States, also powerful and victorious, held a different vision. Its leaders believed that free markets, private enterprise, and democratic institutions offered the best path to peace and prosperity. These two visions grew further apart as both nations sought allies, influence, and security. The Cold War did not begin with a single event. It grew gradually from mistrust, ideological difference, and competing interests. Meetings between the major powers revealed deep disagreements about how Europe should be rebuilt. Western countries supported governments aligned with their political systems. The Soviet Union, determined to protect its border regions and spread its model, supported socialist governments in Eastern Europe. Countries caught between these influences faced difficult choices. Some aligned themselves with either bloc. Others tried to remain independent in a world that was increasingly divided. Eastern Europe became the first region where this division hardened. The Soviet Union supported the establishment of socialist governments in countries such as Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. These states adopted central planning, one-party systems and policies inspired by Marxist-Leninist ideology. Land was collectivized. Industries were nationalized. Political opposition was restricted. Supporters believed that these changes would bring equality and rapid industrial growth. Critics argued that such systems concentrated power in small groups and reduced individual freedoms. The economic and political structure of these states varied. but all shared a belief in the role of the state as the primary organizer of society. Central planning agencies determined production targets, set prices, and allocated resources. Governments invested heavily in heavy industry, education, and healthcare. Many achieved improvements in literacy, housing, and public services. At the same time, shortages of consumer goods became common, and political dissent faced strict limits. The balance between social welfare and personal freedom remained a constant source of tension. The division of Europe became symbolized by physical and political barriers. The most famous of these was the Berlin Wall. It rose in 1961, cutting through a city and leaving profound emotional impact on families divided by its concrete and wire. The wall represented more than a border. It marked the stark contrast between two systems competing for global influence. On one side stood countries striving for market-driven growth. On the other stood countries advocating central planning as the path to fairness. Beyond Europe, the Cold War shaped decolonization. Dozens of countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East sought independence from colonial powers. As they formed new governments, leaders often looked to socialism for guidance. They believed that state planning could help them modernize quickly, reduce inequality, and protect their economies from foreign control. The Soviet Union offered aid, training, and political support, hoping to gain allies. The United States did the same, hoping to limit the spread of socialism. Newly independent countries found themselves navigating between these two global forces while trying to preserve their own priorities. In India, leaders introduced a mixed economy that included significant public ownership alongside private enterprise. In Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser adopted policies that nationalized major industries and expanded social programs. In Algeria, Tanzania, and other African nations, leaders experimented with different forms of socialism designed to match local traditions and needs. These efforts produced varied results. Some countries improved access to education and healthcare. Others struggled with economic inefficiency, political conflict, and external pressures. Latin America also felt the intense pull of Cold War influences. Countries such as Chile, Cuba, and Nicaragua pursued socialist-inspired policies, each in its own way. Cuba's revolution created a government that aligned closely with the Soviet Union. It established universal education and healthcare, expanded literacy programs, and nationalized major industries. Supporters saw these achievements as proof of the potential of socialism. Critics argued that political freedoms were restricted and economic challenges persisted. Chile attempted a democratic path towards socialism under Salvador Allende, focusing on social welfare and nationalization of key industries. External pressures, internal opposition, and a military coup ended this experiment abruptly. Nicaragua's Sandinista movement promoted literacy, land reform, and social services while facing intense conflict and international involvement. In East Asia, the Cold War produced sharp boundaries. North Korea adopted a highly centralized system with strong emphasis on state authority. South Korea developed a path shaped by alliances with the West and gradual economic transformation. Vietnam, after decades of war, unified under a socialist government that implemented land reforms and centralized economic planning. Each country walked a path marked by local conditions and the broader pressures of global rivalry. Throughout the Cold War, both socialism and capitalism evolved in response to one another. The Soviet Union sought to demonstrate the superiority of its system through scientific achievements and industrial growth. Its launch of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, astonished the world and intensified the space race. The United States responded by investing in research, technology, and education. The competition pushed both systems to advance science, develop new technologies, and expand their global presence. Yet the Cold War was not only a contest of progress, it also generated fear, suspicion, and conflict. Nations built large arsenals. Alliances such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact formalized the division. Proxy wars erupted in different regions as each side supported movements aligned with their ideology. These conflicts brought suffering to millions and reshaped entire regions. Throughout these years, both systems claimed to represent the future, yet both produced achievements and hardships. Inside the Soviet Union, central planning achieved rapid industrialization, significant scientific progress, and widespread access to education. At the same time, inefficiencies grew. Factories produced goods that often did not meet public needs. Agricultural output struggled to keep pace. Political dissent remained tightly controlled. Leaders faced the difficult task of maintaining stability while managing an economy that became increasingly complex. Some citizens felt proud of their country's achievements. Others felt frustration at shortages, restrictions, and limits on personal expression. In the West, social welfare programs expanded in part as a response to global ideological competition. Governments introduced policies that supported education, healthcare, and worker rights. These programs helped reduce inequality and improve quality of life, especially in Western Europe. Social democratic parties gained influence and showed that some socialist principles could coexist with market economies. This demonstrated that the socialist movement was not limited to revolutionary forms. It could also shape democratic institutions and improve everyday life in peaceful ways. As the Cold War continued, cracks began to appear within the Soviet system. Economic challenges grew more visible. Public dissatisfaction increased. Leaders attempted reforms with mixed results. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union struggled to sustain its economy, manage political demands, and maintain its global commitments. Reform efforts under Mikhail Gorbachev introduced changes to increase transparency and economic flexibility. These reforms, while intended to strengthen the system, revealed deep structural issues. The Cold War gradually came to an end as Eastern European governments shifted away from single-party systems. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the closing of an era. The Soviet Union dissolved shortly after, marking a major turning point in world history. Many nations transitioned to different economic models. Some moved toward market-based systems. Others attempted gradual reforms. The end of the Soviet Union reshaped global politics and forced socialist movements everywhere to reconsider their paths. As this chapter comes to its quiet ending, imagine the world during the height of the Cold War. Radios broadcast speeches from distant capitals. Maps show lines dividing continents into spheres of influence. Families gather around televisions to watch images of rockets, protests, or parades. Fear and hope mix as people everywhere wonder what the future will bring. The rivalry between superpowers shaped the choices of nations and individuals, leaving marks that remain visible today. The end of the Second World War left behind a world that needed rebuilding. Cities carried deep scars. Roads, bridges, factories, and neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Millions of people had lost homes, loved ones, and the sense of stability that daily life depends upon. Nations emerging from the conflict understood that if they wished to avoid another era of turmoil, they needed to build societies where citizens felt secure, supported, and hopeful about the future. Amid this long rebuilding process, a new interpretation of socialism gained strength. It did not seek revolution. It did not attempt to dismantle parliaments, markets, or democratic institutions. Instead, it attempted to blend the principles of equality, solidarity, and public welfare with the practicality of a market economy. This direction became known as social democracy, and it reshaped much of the Western world during the middle decades of the 20th century. Social democracy grew from earlier reformist movements that believed gradual change could improve society without the upheavals associated with revolution. Leaders in this movement argued that inequality could be reduced through democratic processes. They believed that government should play an active role in supporting citizens, regulating industries, and providing essential services. They argued that markets could remain a source of innovation and productivity, but their excesses needed to be balanced by social protections. The devastation of war created an environment where these ideas gained broad support. Communities understood that rebuilding required unity. Governments recognized that social stability depended on more than military strength. Workers demanded security after years of hardship. Employers saw the need for cooperative relationships that would prevent future disruptions. Together, these pressures pushed many countries toward policies that placed well-being at the center of national priorities. Western Europe became the heart of this transformation. In countries such as Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, social democratic parties or coalitions entered government and guided new forms of policy. Their programs varied from country to country, but they shared several common goals. They sought to reduce poverty, expand access to education, strengthen worker rights, and create healthcare systems available to everyone regardless of income. They believed that societies should protect individuals from risks such as illness, unemployment, and old age. One of the earliest and most influential examples appeared in the United Kingdom. After the war, citizens voted for a government that promised bold social reforms. In the years that followed, the country established a national healthcare system, expanded public housing, and created programs to support families and workers. The National Health Service became a symbol of the belief that healthcare was a universal right rather than a privilege. It provided medical services free at the point of use, funded through taxes, and managed to ensure equal access. This idea spread across Europe and became central to many social democratic models. Germany adopted a different but equally significant approach. After facing the devastation of war and the tragedy of earlier authoritarianism, West Germany built a system that blended market principles with strong social protections. This model became known as the social market economy. It allowed private enterprise to thrive while maintaining robust labor rights, public health care, unemployment insurance, and pensions. Workers participated in management decisions in many industries, creating a sense of stability and shared responsibility. In Scandinavia, social democracy reached one of its most developed forms. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark created societies where the state played an active role in providing education, childcare, healthcare, housing assistance, and public infrastructure. Unions became strong partners in economic planning. Taxes were high but widely accepted because citizens saw the benefits in universal services, strong social protections, and high levels of trust. These countries achieved low levels of inequality, strong economic performance, and social cohesion that became admired internationally. Outside Europe, social democratic ideas also spread. In Canada, public healthcare systems emerged at provincial and national levels. In New Zealand and Australia, governments expanded pensions, healthcare, and public services. In Japan, post-war reforms included worker protections, land redistribution, and educational investment. Many countries realized that social stability required shared responsibility and a commitment to public welfare. The rise of social democracy demonstrated that socialist ideas were not limited to revolutionary movements. They could influence democratic societies, shape public policy, and improve lives without drastic political upheaval. Social democratic policies help reduce poverty, narrow income gaps, and provide citizens with security. They allowed people to pursue education, careers, and family life with a sense of protection against sudden misfortune. These successes did not come without challenges. Funding large social programs required careful management and high levels of taxation. Governments needed to balance economic competition with social protection. Critics argued that some programs created inefficiency or reduced incentives for innovation. Supporters countered that a healthy and well-educated population created stronger economies and more resilient societies. The debates surrounding these questions continue today. The expansion of welfare states also depended on strong cooperation between employers, unions, and governments. This cooperation, often called social partnership, allowed countries to maintain competitive industries while ensuring fair wages and safe working conditions. Employers accepted regulation because it provided stability. Workers accepted compromises because unions played an active role in decision-making. Governments acted as mediators to ensure balance. Such cooperation created frameworks that lasted for decades. During the later decades of the 20th century, however, social democracy faced new pressures. Globalization changed the nature of markets. Factories moved across borders. Technologies transformed industries. Financial markets gained influence. In some countries, unemployment rose as industries adapted to global competition. These changes challenged traditional economic models and forced governments to reconsider how to fund and manage welfare states. Social democratic movements responded in different ways. Some adapted by modernizing policies, reforming public services, and encouraging innovation. Others struggled to maintain support as economic conditions changed. Yet the core belief that societies should protect their citizens remained strong. Even as reforms adjusted systems to new realities, the idea that governments had a responsibility to provide education, healthcare, and social protections continued to shape political debates. In many countries, welfare states became deeply rooted in national identity. Citizens saw them not as temporary measures, but as essential parts of a fair society. Families relied on access to healthcare. Students depended on affordable education. Elderly citizens counted on pensions. These programs created a sense of security that shaped everyday life. They allowed people to plan for the future, raise children with confidence, and pursue opportunities that might otherwise have been impossible. The story of social democracy also reveals a quieter, often overlooked truth. Many of the most successful social policies were created not through confrontation, but through dialogue. Governments, unions, and employers met to negotiate agreements. Communities participated in discussions about public services. Change came through compromise, patience, and shared responsibility. This peaceful path contrasts sharply with the violence and conflict that marked some other socialist experiments. As this chapter draws to a gentle close, imagine the atmosphere of post-war Europe. Reconstruction cranes rise above ruined streets. Families gather in new apartment blocks built through public investment. Children walk to schools rebuilt with public funds. Nurses and doctors treat patients in new hospitals where care is free at the point of use. These scenes reflect the spirit of a generation that believes societies could be rebuilt not only with bricks and steel, but with compassion and cooperation. The middle and late decades of the 20th century brought winds of change that touched every part of the world. The great ideological battles that defined earlier generations began to shift. The optimism that surrounded certain socialist experiments dimmed as new economic pressures, political conflicts, and social changes emerged. At the same time, many welfare states faced challenges from globalization, technological transformation, and the growing influence of new economic ideas. These developments created a moment of uncertainty for socialist movements everywhere. Old certainties weakened, while new questions demanded attention. The first cracks appeared inside the centrally planned economies of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. During the years following the Second World War, these countries had achieved significant accomplishments, Literacy improved, healthcare became more accessible, and industries expanded rapidly. Many citizens gained access to housing, education, and employment in ways that had once seemed impossible. For some families, this brought stability and dignity that had been absent in earlier eras. Yet behind these achievements lay deeper problems. Central planning relied on detailed instructions for every factory and farm. Ministries set production quotas, assigned resources, and controlled distribution. This structure worked when economies were simpler and focused on heavy industry. As societies developed more complex needs, the system began to strain. Factories produced goods that did not always match consumer demand. Shortages of everyday items became common. Waiting lists for cars, appliances, or housing grew long. Citizens learned to navigate shortages with patience, creativity, and occasional frustration. Political life also became increasingly rigid. Single-party rule limited public debate. Government institutions prioritized stability over flexibility. Newspapers and broadcasters avoided criticism. Citizens who questioned the system risked punishment. These conditions created a sense of stagnation. People continued with daily routines, yet many felt that the system could not adapt to a rapidly changing world. Reformers emerged, but their suggestions often met resistance from those who feared instability. By the 1970s and 1980s, economic problems grew more visible. Productivity slowed. Agricultural output failed to meet expectations. Technological innovation lagged behind that of Western countries. The cost of maintaining large military forces further strained resources. Leaders introduced partial reforms, hoping to correct inefficiencies without altering the system too deeply. Some of these changes helped. Others created confusion or unintended consequences. The most dramatic reforms came in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev. He introduced policies that encouraged economic openness and greater transparency. Factories received more freedom to make decisions. Journalists gained more room to report honestly. Citizens began to discuss issues that had long been kept quiet. These changes aimed to strengthen socialism by modernizing it. Yet they revealed weaknesses that had accumulated over decades. Economic expectations rose faster than reforms could deliver. Political movements formed, each with different visions for the future. National groups demanded autonomy. The unity of the Soviet Union grew fragile. Meanwhile, Eastern European countries faced their own pressures. Economic stagnation frustrated citizens. Restrictions on public life created growing dissatisfaction. Peaceful protests began to appear. Workers went on strike. Students organized discussions. Religious groups offered spaces for dialogue. Reform movements pushed for change. In 1989, these pressures reached a breaking point. Governments across Eastern Europe shifted rapidly. The Berlin Wall fell. Orders opened. Political systems were rewritten. The Cold War's division of Europe ended. A new era began. These changes forced socialist movements worldwide to reconsider their strategies and identities. The collapse of the Soviet model created a sense of uncertainty. Parties and activists who had once looked to Moscow for inspiration now sought new frameworks. Some felt discouraged. Others felt liberated. Many recognized that socialism needed to adapt to new economic realities and social expectations. The challenges were not limited to socialist states. Social democracies in Western Europe also faced pressures during the late 20th century. Globalization changed the structure of economies. Factories moved to countries with lower labor costs. Automation replaced many jobs. Financial markets gained influence. Governments struggled to maintain generous welfare systems while managing new economic constraints. Unemployment rose in some regions. Public debates intensified over taxation, spending, and the role of the state. These pressures led some social democratic parties to adopt policies that blended traditional social protections with market-oriented reforms. They encouraged private investment, supported entrepreneurship, and modernized public services. Some embraced ideas of fiscal responsibility, hoping to maintain welfare states in a changing world. Supporters believed that adaptation was essential. Critics argued that these changes weakened the movement's original principles. The debates reflected deeper questions about how to balance equality, efficiency, and innovation in global economies that move faster each year. Beyond Europe, socialist movements in developing countries also confronted new realities. Many African, Asian, and Latin American nations had adopted variations of socialism during their early years of independence. They hoped that state planning and public ownership would help them modernize rapidly. Some achieved progress in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Others struggled with limited resources, internal conflicts, and economic instability. The debt crises of the 1980s placed additional strain on these countries, forcing many to accept international loans tied to policies that reduced public spending and privatized industries. As global conditions changed, movements across the world began to explore new approaches. Some emphasized community-based development, focusing on local needs rather than large state programs. Others embraced participatory democracy, encouraging citizens to play active roles in public decision-making. Some revived cooperative models that blended private initiative with social responsibility. These experiments demonstrated that socialism could continue to evolve in creative ways. At the same time, new social issues emerged that earlier socialist theories had not fully addressed. Environmental concerns grew as industries expanded and pollution worsened. Feminist movements challenged traditional assumptions about gender roles within both capitalist and socialist societies. Civil rights movements highlighted injustices related to race, ethnicity, and identity. Technological change raised questions about privacy, labor rights, and the future of work. Socialists, like many others, had to respond to a world changing faster than political theory could predict. The late 20th century became a period of reflection. Writers, activists, and scholars examined earlier successes and failures. They asked why certain experiments had collapsed and why others endured. They debated how socialism could remain relevant in an interconnected world where markets crossed borders and information traveled instantly. Many argued that the core principles of fairness, solidarity, and public responsibility remained essential, even if older structures needed reconsideration. These reflections led to new visions for the 21st century. Some movements focused on expanding welfare states in modern ways, improving childcare, education, and healthcare. Others emphasized sustainability, arguing that environmental protection required collective action. Still others explored models that combined public ownership with democratic control, hoping to avoid the inefficiencies of central planning and the inequality of unregulated markets. The reinvention of socialism also required a deeper understanding of freedom. Many citizens valued both social protections and individual liberties. They sought societies where equality did not come at the cost of personal expression, where stability did not suppress creativity, and where collective responsibility existed alongside personal opportunity. Social movements responded by exploring policies that supported both fairness and autonomy. Through all these changes, a quiet truth remained. The idea of socialism survived because the problems it tried to address continued to exist. Inequality persisted. Workers faced uncertain futures in rapidly changing economies. Families struggled with rising costs. Communities needed public investment. Environmental challenges demanded cooperation across generations. These issues reminded people everywhere that the search for a fair society was not finished. The 21st century opened with a world connected in ways few earlier generations could have imagined. Information traveled instantly across continents. Goods moved rapidly through vast supply chains. Computers, satellites, and the internet reshaped daily life. Entire industries transformed overnight. Opportunities grew for some, while uncertainty rose for many others. In this landscape, socialism did not disappear. It evolved, adapted, and found new forms of expression shaped by the remarkable changes sweeping through modern life. The fall of the Soviet Union had left many wondering whether socialist ideas would fade into history. Some believed that market economies had become the natural order of the world. Others argued that democracy and capitalism had triumphed permanently. Yet, as the century progressed, new challenges emerged that reopened conversations about fairness, cooperation, and the responsibilities of society. These challenges did not come from the same sources that shaped earlier movements. They came from the digital revolution, global inequality, environmental crises, and the shifting nature of work. Globalization created prosperity for some regions, but it also widened gaps between countries and within them. Wealth concentrated in the hands of corporations and individuals who controlled technology, data, and global finance. Workers in many countries saw wages stagnate even as productivity increased. Communities that once relied on stable industries faced closures, relocations, or automation. These changes left many people feeling uncertain about their place in a world moving faster than they could follow. Technology became both a symbol of progress and a source of anxiety. Machines performed tasks once done by human hands. Algorithms managed systems once guided by people. Artificial intelligence promised to transform entire professions. These developments raised deep questions. What happens when machines replace human labor? How should societies ensure that the benefits of technology are shared fairly? Who controls the data that shapes modern life? These questions echoed concerns that earlier socialists had raised about the relationship between workers and the systems that depended on their labor. In this new environment, socialist ideas returned to public debate in renewed forms. They resurfaced not as rigid blueprints, but as frameworks for addressing modern problems. Movements emerged that focused on guaranteeing healthcare, education, and housing in societies where living costs had risen sharply. Activists and thinkers began discussing universal basic income as a response to automation. Economists explored new ways to regulate global finance and protect workers in industries shaped by digital platforms. Socialist parties in Europe adapted to these changes in different ways. Some modernized their programs by embracing technology, environmental protection, and gender equality. They proposed policies that expanded childcare, improved access to university education, and strengthened labor protections. Others faced difficulties as economic changes and political polarization made consensus harder to achieve. Social democratic movements now had to defend welfare states built in earlier decades, while designing new policies for a digital age. In Latin America, a wave of left-leaning governments emerged during the early years of the century. They sought to address inequality, expand social programs, and assert greater national control over resources. In countries like Brazil, Bolivia, and Ecuador, leaders introduced policies aimed at reducing poverty and strengthening public services. These governments faced both successes and challenges. Economic growth allowed them to expand social programs, but fluctuations in global markets created instability. Political tensions grew as movements struggled to balance social reforms with economic realities. In Africa, socialist ideas influenced new experiments in development and governance. Some countries focused on community-based programs that encouraged local participation. Others introduced social welfare initiatives designed to expand education and healthcare. International cooperation, technology, and regional integration helped shape modern forms of economic planning. Many nations explored policies that blended market activity with social responsibility, hoping to overcome the legacy of historical inequality. Asia offered a wide array of approaches. China, after decades of dramatic economic reforms, developed a system that blended market mechanisms with strong state involvement. The government played a central role in guiding industries, regulating markets, and investing in infrastructure, while private enterprise expanded rapidly. This model sparked debates about the meaning of socialism in a world shaped by global trade and technological competition. Some viewed China's approach as a new version of state-guided development. Others argued that it reflected a unique path shaped by historical, political, and cultural factors. Meanwhile, social movements in many countries focused on environmental issues. Climate change emerged as one of the most pressing problems of the century. Rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation threatened communities worldwide. These challenges required cooperation on a scale larger than any one nation. Environmental activists argued that markets alone could not address these global risks. They urged governments to take stronger action, regulate industries, and protect natural resources. This gave rise to ideas such as eco-socialism, which combined environmental sustainability with principles of equality and collective responsibility. As the century progressed, new generations entered political life with their own experiences and concerns. Many young people grew up in a world marked by economic recessions, rising living costs, and high levels of student debt. They saw climate change shaping their future. They watched technological companies gain unprecedented influence. These experiences led many to question the assumptions of earlier decades. They sought solutions that addressed immediate challenges while also offering long-term security. Movements focusing on social justice, gender equality, racial equality, and workers' rights gained strength. They emphasized participation, transparency, and community involvement. Many activists argued that earlier models of socialism had not paid enough attention to individual freedoms or marginalized groups. They believed that modern socialist movements needed to embrace diversity, protect personal autonomy, and respond to the unique challenges faced by women, minorities, and vulnerable communities. The digital age also transformed the way movements organized. Social media allowed activists to communicate across borders instantly. Campaigns could spread within hours. People from different cultures and backgrounds could coordinate efforts, share ideas, and support one another. This created opportunities for new forms of political participation, though it also introduced challenges related to misinformation, polarization, and the speed of public debate. One of the most interesting developments of the 21st century has been the rise of cooperative and community-owned enterprises supported by digital tools. Technology allowed groups of workers to manage platforms collectively, share profits, and control their own data. Some cities experimented with participatory budgeting, allowing residents to decide how public funds should be used. Others introduced public internet services, affordable housing programs, and new models of public transport. These experiments reflected the desire to combine technological innovation with democratic decision-making. Despite these creative developments, socialism in the 21st century continued to face challenges. Global inequality remained widespread. Wealth accumulated at the top of economic systems, while many families struggled to afford basic needs. Housing became more expensive in major cities. Healthcare costs rose in countries without strong public systems. Environmental degradation continued at an alarming pace. These issues reminded societies that solutions required cooperation, planning, and a willingness to look beyond short-term interests. Another challenge came from political polarization. Many societies experience growing divisions over identity, culture, and economic priorities. Public trust in institutions weakened in some countries. Debates became sharper and faster due to digital communication. These tensions made it harder to build consensus around social programs or long-term planning. Movements that sought cooperation and solidarity had to navigate environments where public discourse often felt fragmented. Yet, through all these challenges, the idea of socialism remained alive because the questions it addressed continued to matter. How should society respond to inequality? How should nations manage technological change? How can communities protect the environment for future generations? What responsibilities do governments have to ensure that all citizens live with dignity? These questions echoed through classrooms, businesses, parliaments, and community meetings. The 21st century did not produce a single, unified form of socialism. Instead, it introduced a landscape of diverse approaches. Some nations maintained traditional welfare states. Others experimented with new models of public ownership, digital cooperation, or environmental planning. Some movements focused on economic fairness. Others focused on social justice. All these efforts reflected the rich and complex nature of modern societies. As this chapter reaches its gentle ending, picture the world of today. A world filled with screens, satellites, crowded cities, quiet villages, and shifting landscapes. Students gather around laptops in cafes. Workers join online meetings with colleagues across continents. Families discuss rising costs and uncertain futures. Scientists monitor climate patterns. Social movements gather in public squares and digital spaces alike. Across these scenes runs a shared thread, the timeless effort to create a fairer, more secure, and more humane society. The long history of socialism has always carried more than ideas, movements, or governments. It has also carried misunderstandings. Some of these misunderstandings began the moment the word first appeared. Others grew during political conflicts. Still others came from confusion about what socialism tried to solve and how it tried to solve it. As the idea traveled across decades and continents, its meaning stretched, shifted, and sometimes became blurred. The result is a landscape filled with questions, assumptions, and interpretations that often overshadow the core themes at the heart of socialist thought. The complexity of socialism makes misunderstandings almost inevitable. Socialism is not a single system, a single policy, or a single model. It has many branches, each shaped by different cultures, histories, and economic conditions. This diversity brought creativity, but it also created confusion. One country's version of socialism might focus on public healthcare. Another might focus on land reform. A third might embrace cooperatives, while a fourth might centralize economic planning. Some movements pursued peaceful reforms. Others pursued revolutionary change. These differences made it easy for opponents to blend them together and for supporters to lose sight of distinctions. One common misunderstanding is the belief that socialism aims to eliminate all private property. In reality, most forms of socialism distinguish between personal belongings and major economic assets. Owning a home, a car, or personal goods is not the issue. The central question concerns large-scale property used to produce wealth, such as factories, natural resources, or major industries. Socialists argued that the way this kind of property is owned, and who benefits from it, shapes society more than anything else. Some believed in public ownership. Others supported cooperatives or mixed systems. But the goal was not to remove personal possessions. It was to examine how wealth and opportunity were distributed. Another widespread misconception is that socialism rejects freedom. This idea grew during the Cold War, when some countries claimed to represent socialism while limiting political competition and personal expression. Critics pointed to these examples as proof that socialism and freedom were incompatible. Yet this interpretation overlooks the long tradition of democratic socialism, labor movements, and reform efforts that emphasized freedom, participation, and human rights. Many socialists believed that freedom required more than legal rights. They argued that people need access to education, healthcare, and stable work in order to make meaningful choices in life. Without these, political freedom becomes fragile. A third misunderstanding paints socialism as identical to the Soviet model. The Soviet Union played an enormous role in shaping public perceptions, both positive and negative. Its early achievements impressed some. Its later repression and economic struggles disillusioned many. But socialism existed long before the Soviet Union and continued long after its dissolution. Countries that pursued democratic socialism, social democracy, or cooperative economics represent different traditions that cannot be reduced to one historical example. When the Soviet Union collapsed, some assumed socialism had ended as well. Yet the welfare states of Scandinavia, community movements in Africa, and labor traditions in Europe all demonstrated that socialism had many paths. Misunderstandings also come from unclear definitions. The word socialism has been used to describe policies such as public healthcare, free education, pensions, worker cooperatives, national industries, universal childcare, housing programs, and progressive taxation. It has also been used to describe full state ownership of the economy. These policies are not identical, yet the same label has been applied to all of them. This creates confusion in public debate. Some imagine socialism as a complete transformation of society. Others see it as a set of policies that strengthen public welfare. Without clarity, conversations become tangled and disagreements deepen. Another misconception suggests that socialism opposes markets. In reality, many socialist traditions recognize that markets can be useful tools. Social democracies often combine regulated markets with strong social protections. Cooperative enterprises operate in markets, but use democratic decision-making instead of traditional ownership structures. Some movements support mixed economies, where public and private sectors coexist. The debate is not about eliminating all market activity. It is about determining when markets serve the public good and when they require guidance, limits, or alternatives to prevent exploitation. Some misunderstandings arise from historical context. During the 19th and 20th centuries, political battles shaped public perception. Governments used propaganda to portray socialism as a threat. Socialist movements, in turn, sometimes portrayed capitalism in extreme terms. These portrayals shaped generations of thinking. They were designed to win support or weaken opponents, not to provide accurate explanations. The result is a long legacy of emotional responses that continues to influence debates today. A further confusion comes from the belief that socialism inevitably leads to inefficiency. Critics argue that public ownership or strong social programs reduce incentives, slow innovation, and create bureaucratic waste. Supporters counter with examples of countries that achieved high levels of innovation, stability, and economic growth while maintaining strong welfare systems. They point to healthcare outcomes, educational success, and high standards of living in regions with robust social protections. The truth is that efficiency depends on design, management, and context, not on labels alone. Another misunderstanding suggests that socialism guarantees equality in every aspect of life. Socialist thinkers rarely aimed for identical outcomes. Their concern was fairness, not uniformity. They focused on reducing extreme inequality, ensuring access to essential services, and giving people a stable foundation. They wanted societies where wealth did not determine dignity, opportunity, or survival. Equality, in this sense, meant access to the conditions necessary for a meaningful and secure life. A different kind of misunderstanding emerged in recent decades. Some believed that socialism belonged to the past. They saw it as a product of the industrial age, shaped by factories, railroads, and conflicts between workers and owners. They argued that in a digital world dominated by information, technology, and global networks, old theories had become irrelevant. Yet many modern challenges, automation, inequality, housing shortages, healthcare costs, and environmental crises, echo the concerns that socialism has addressed since its earliest days. These issues remind us that questions about fairness never fade. Socialism has also been misunderstood in cultures where the word carries strong emotional weight. In some places, it triggers memories of oppression. In others, it recalls achievements in education or healthcare. These emotional associations make it difficult to discuss socialism calmly. People respond not to ideas but to memories, stories, and inherited fears or hopes. A conversation about public housing or universal healthcare can become entangled in historical anxieties. This emotional landscape must be acknowledged in order to think clearly. One reason misunderstandings persist is that socialism is often discussed in extremes. Critics point to the most repressive examples. Supporters point to the most successful social programs. Rarely do discussions explore the full range of models that exist between these poles. Rarely do they examine how different societies have adapted ideas to meet their own needs. Without this nuance, debates become simplified, polarized, and incomplete. At its heart, socialism asks a series of questions rather than offering a single answer. How should society balance individual ambition with collective responsibility? How should wealth be distributed in a world where economic forces shape every life? How should communities support those who face hardship, illness, or limited opportunity? How can economic systems ensure dignity for all, not only for those who excel? These questions are ancient, and they remain relevant because they touch the deepest foundations of social life. Many misunderstandings can be resolved by returning to these core questions. Socialism is not a rigid structure, but a tradition of thought that tries to address persistent challenges. It is a conversation that has lasted for centuries, carried by different cultures, shaped by different eras, and adapted for changing needs. Some answers worked, others failed. Some approaches improved lives, others created new problems. But the conversation itself has endured, because the issues it explores continue to affect billions of people. As this chapter nears its gentle ending, imagine a quiet room where citizens gather to discuss the future. The chairs are simple, the lights are warm. People speak calmly about the needs of their communities. Some worry about healthcare. Others speak about wages or housing. A teacher describes the importance of education. A parent talks about rising costs. A young worker wonders how to build a stable life. These conversations do not belong to one ideology or another. They belong to all of society. The misunderstandings that surround socialism become smaller when we return to the real concerns behind them. When we set aside labels and look closely at the lives of people, the discussion becomes clearer. Socialism is one of humanity's long attempts to imagine fairness, stability, and dignity in a world that often struggles to provide them. Its myths are many, its meanings diverse, and its future still open to interpretation. The story of socialism is long, winding, and filled with contrasts. It begins with scattered hopes in ancient communities, rises into dreams during the early industrial age, becomes theory in quiet libraries, grows into movements across continents, and enters the 21st century, reshaped by technology, global trade, and new social demands. Few ideas have traveled such a distance. Few have been interpreted in so many ways. Few have inspired such passionate loyalty or fierce criticism. And yet, through every change, the idea endured. To understand its long echo, it helps to look not only at movements or governments, but at the quiet shifts that socialism brought into everyday life. Many of the rights and protections that people around the world now take for granted grew from the long struggle for fairness. The 8-hour workday, safer workplaces, pensions, unemployment insurance, maternity leave, and public education all carry influences from socialist thought. Even societies that rejected socialism formally often adopted programs inspired by socialist movements because they improved life for ordinary people. These achievements reveal something important. The legacy of socialism cannot be understood only through revolutions or centralized states. It also lives in reforms, protections, and shared commitments that slowly expanded across generations. Ideas that once seemed bold or radical gradually became ordinary pieces of social life. Over time, many societies accepted the belief that no person should be denied basic dignity because of illness, accident, age, or hardship. This belief sits at the center of countless public institutions, from hospitals to schools to retirement systems. At the same time, socialism's legacy includes difficult lessons. When certain governments concentrated too much power, they created environments where individual freedoms suffered. When planning became rigid, economies struggled to innovate and respond to society's needs. When political dissent was suppressed, public trust weakened. These experiences showed the danger of confusing ideals with absolute certainty. They also revealed how challenging it is to build fairness without unintentionally creating new forms of inequality or control. The echo of socialism can be heard in debates that continue today. In many countries, people ask whether the wealth created in digital economies should be shared more fairly. They question how societies can support those displaced by automation. They discuss the responsibility governments have to ensure that healthcare, education, and housing remain accessible. These questions are not new. They echo concerns raised during the earliest days of industrialization, yet they appear again with modern urgency. Some movements respond by proposing stronger public investment. Others suggest new forms of community ownership, from local cooperatives to employee-run enterprises. Some promote universal basic income to provide stability in a world where work is changing rapidly. Environmental activists argue that protecting the planet requires collective action, long-term planning, and the recognition that certain goods cannot be left solely to market forces. These new paths show how socialist ideas continue to evolve. They adapt to new challenges, new technologies, and new generations. The legacy of socialism is not only political or economic, it is also moral. It teaches that societies are judged not only by their wealth, but by how they treat those who struggle. It teaches that fairness requires more than good intentions. It requires structures that support dignity, stability, and opportunity. It teaches that cooperation can be powerful, that communities thrive when people work together, and that progress often begins with questioning systems that seem unchangeable. Socialism also shaped the way people imagine the future. Even when individuals do not identify with socialist movements, they often inherit the belief that society can improve, that inequality can be challenged, and that institutions can be redesigned. This belief was not always common in earlier centuries. Many once assumed that power and privilege were fixed, that poverty was permanent, and that social orders could not be altered. Socialism helped break these assumptions. It encouraged people to see society as something created by human choices, not something carved in stone. In the modern world, the future of socialism remains uncertain, not because its questions have disappeared, but because those questions have grown more complex. Technology changes faster than political systems can respond. Climate change demands cooperation across borders. Inequality grows in some regions, even as others experience progress. Political polarization makes dialogue difficult. These challenges require ideas that combine fairness with flexibility, responsibility with freedom, and collective action with respect for individual voice. Some thinkers argue that socialism must reconnect with its roots, focusing once again on community, solidarity, and public well-being. Others argue that socialism must embrace innovation, digital tools, and modern economic insights. Still others suggest that socialism should become less about ownership and more about empowerment, giving people the resources they need to shape their lives. These perspectives differ, yet they share a belief that fairness requires continuous effort. The future of socialism may not look like the past. It may not involve large state projects or rigid planning. It may instead grow through networks of communities, digital cooperatives, public-private partnerships, or new global agreements that address shared challenges. It may appear in policies that support families, workers, and the environment without adopting older labels. It may emerge quietly through reforms that reshape systems over time. The idea no longer belongs to a single movement. It belongs to everyone who believes that society can be kinder, wiser, and more just. As this long journey reaches its closing moments, imagine the thread that runs through centuries of thought. It begins with early humans gathering food together, continues through philosophers who question the meaning of justice, travels through factories filled with noise and exhaustion, moves into libraries where theories took form, rises in movements that fought for rights, and stretches into digital worlds shaped by algorithms and global trade. This thread represents humanity's continuous search for balance between individual ambition and collective responsibility. Picture this thread as it passes through time, woven into the lives of millions. It touches workers demanding safety. It touches nurses caring for patients in public hospitals. It touches teachers helping children read. It touches elderly citizens receiving support after a lifetime of work. It touches young people seeking a fair chance to build their lives. These quiet, everyday moments reveal the lasting influence of an idea that once existed only in the hopes of a few. As you rest at the end of this long journey, let the story settle gently. Socialism's history is not a straight line. It is a tapestry of experiments, debates, movements, and reflections. It contains both failures and successes. It carries both caution and promise. But above all, it carries a belief that society can be shaped with intention, compassion, and care. The future will continue to ask difficult questions. The answers will require creativity and cooperation. And while no single idea can solve every problem, the long echo of socialism remains a reminder that fairness is a goal worth pursuing, that dignity is a right worth protecting, and that humanity is at its best when it imagines a world where no one is left behind. Thank you for walking through this history so patiently, step by gentle step. Whenever you are ready, you may let the story fade and allow the quiet to take its place.